In this video, we're going to answer the question, what is translanguaging? So I'll provide kind of some general understandings and definition for this term. All right, so a simple definition of translanguaging is that it is the flexible and fluid use of multiple language practices by multilingual people and communities. So translanguaging then is a term that describes the flexible way that multilingual people actually use language, especially when they're engaging with other multilingual people and with their larger multilingual communities. It's important to emphasize that this is a natural and a normal way of using language. It's not that people are confused, and that's why they are kind of shifting, or what appears to be shifting between languages. But it's just that all of these different linguistic resources are part of their repertoire. And so when they're with other people who share those languages, they use those different resources. Translanguaging also emphasizes using language practices or languaging. That's why translanguaging itself ends in ing, right? So it's emphasizing that we don't have language, we use it. So it's a different way of thinking about language. It's all about how people actually use language in their everyday lives, especially how bilingual and multilingual people engage flexibly, drawing upon all the different linguistic features that are part of their repertoire. There we go. So to give you a more concrete example of that, this is a picture of my daughter, Sophia, when she was 2. And Sophia, growing up, was exposed to both English and Spanish from birth. So my husband and I speak English and Spanish, although we do mostly use English at home. But we would use some Spanish with Sophia, and then she also was at a daycare where she was in Spanish all day. So she was getting English and Spanish throughout her day as she was growing up, and we saw that in some of the early utterances that she was producing as an emergent bilingual. So for example, she would say things like más please instead of more please, or más por favor. So starting to kind of bring the different features of her repertoire together. Or she would say, there was a time when she got really into seeing everyone's belly buttons. So she would sometimes ask us to lift up our shirt and show us our ombligo. She would say, sí, ombligo. And she would even bring kind of Spanish grammatical patterns into English. So you see this example here with juice apple. So in Spanish, you would say jugo de manzana. And so instead of saying apple juice, she would sometimes say juice apple. So you see the way that my daughter, when she was little, was kind of beginning to make sense of the different language features that she was exposed to, and bringing them together, translanguaging in a way to communicate, right? Now, it's important to emphasize that it isn't just young bilingual learners who do this, and then they kind of move into a space of just using English or just using Spanish. When bilingual people are around other bilinguals, they do this, right? Because these language features are part of their linguistic repertoire. And so this is something that bilinguals do often because they're using whatever resources come to them in the moment or seem most relevant to communicate, to make meaning. I see some of these examples of bilinguals doing this as well in bilingual classrooms. So I spend a lot of time in bilingual classrooms, and these are just 2 examples of some of the ways that I've heard young bilingual students or emergent bilingual students translanguaging. This first example comes from a 2nd grade classroom where I was overhearing a math center where there were 4 students sitting around the table. And one student had the deck of cards that they were using, and he held it out to his classmates and said, "¿Quién quiere shuffle this deck?" Who wants to shuffle this deck? And I think it was a great example of the fact that this child was in a bilingual classroom with other bilingual kids, or a classroom where everybody was becoming bilingual together. And so he knew he could flexibly draw upon English and Spanish and ask this question, and it would be understood, right? So this doesn't necessarily indicate that he didn't know the words in English or in Spanish to put this statement in, or this question in one language or the other. It just shows me that he's drawing upon his linguistic repertoire to ask a question to a group of other bilingual children, right? The second example I love as well, this was told to me from a kindergarten dual language teacher that I worked with in Wisconsin. And she told me the story of being out at recess one day, and a kindergartner in her class came running up to her and said, Miss Fulanita me tago. And my friend was kind of trying to figure out what she meant by me atacó, because that's not a Spanish verb. And so she was like, "Te atacó? She attacked you?" And the little girl said, "No, no, no, Miss me atacó." And after some back and forth, she finally realized she was saying that she tagged her. So she was taking the verb tag from English and creating a Spanish verb with it, me atacó. And this is something that happens that bilingual children and bilingual people do all the time, right? Kind of mixing and experimenting with language in creative ways, because as we draw, as bilingual and multilingual people draw upon their full linguistic repertoire to make meaning, that's part of that process, right? So those are just two examples of what translanguaging can look like and sound like. And so really translanguaging is rooted in this stance that believes that while languages may look and sound different on the outside, so I may hear someone speaking and say, hello, that is English, and bonjour, that is French. On the inside, bilingual individuals have one holistic linguistic repertoire. They're not double monolinguals, right? Activating just one part of their brain when they're speaking English and then turning off that part to activate the other part of their brain when they're speaking Spanish. So really thinking holistically about the language resources that are part of a bilingual person's repertoire. And this is a great metaphor that Ofelia Garcia uses to kind of describe this, describe translanguaging. She says that translanguaging also embraces a dynamic understanding of bilingualism. So rather than thinking about bilingualism as something balanced, that you have to have, full proficiency in Spanish and full proficiency in English to be considered bilingual, a translanguaging perspective or a translanguaging stance understands that bilingualism is dynamic and that someone's linguistic repertoire develops according to the context within which that language and those language features are being used. So like an all-terrain vehicle, the linguistic repertoire adapts to the terrain, right? And different language features might be used in different contexts depending on the terrain. And importantly, as we start to think about translanguaging as we move into pedagogy, translanguaging is not just about language, it's a social justice stance that centers racialized bilingual students' repertoires and lifeways rather than attempting to remediate them. Too often when children are translanguaging or even just bringing bits of their home language into the English, oftentimes English-only classroom spaces, their ways of languaging and their knowledges are not considered valid for those spaces, right? And so translanguaging is really about centering the way that racialized bilingual children use language, the flexible and dynamic ways that they make meaning rather than trying to fix them or see them as a problem. So as we move forward in this course, I encourage you to kind of think about the ways that you can continue to do this in your own practice and really be thoughtful about how we might bring students' home languages and dynamic languaging practices to the center of our practice.